And there we go, we're going to begin. So as I was saying, please guys share. And with us today, we have two super experts that are going to be talking about the Minigrids, particularly in the African continent, because it seems that that unlocks so many new customers and such a huge opportunity that everyone should be paying attention to it. We do have a third speaker that we're having some technical difficulties with, so hopefully we will be able to connect her in. And if we can, then you'll hear from her as well, but otherwise we're still gonna have two super panelists without today. So I'd like to introduce them to you first of all. So Sachiko, please, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and your company and what you do?
Yes, hi everyone. My name is Sachi Gerber. I'm a senior associate with Rocky Mountain Institute, and I specifically work with our Sustainable Energy for Economic Development program, which is our Africa-based program. But today I'm calling in from Colorado in the US.
Excellent. So we have a lot of diversity here from Colorado. Nicole, please, could you introduce yourself as well? Sorry, Nicole, you have to unmute yourself. We cannot hear you at the moment. So sorry.
Thank you. My name is Nicole Poindexter, and I'm the CEO of Energicity Corp, which is a holding company for mini-grid operations in Ghana, Sierra Leone, and Nigeria. And I'm currently in Ghana today.
Wow, look at that. We have someone in Ghana, someone in Colorado, myself in Madrid, and Nicole and I actually met in the Sahara a few months back. And hopefully if Sunita can join, she's also joining from Ghana, but as I said, we're having a few technical difficulties, and she would represent the World Bank. Hopefully we can get her in for you. But in any case, we have two great presentations. So I'm gonna ask Sachiko to prepare her presentations that we start with her. So for those who know me, who've been here before, or if you're new, this is how it's gonna work. First presentation from Sachiko, then from Nicole, hopefully Sunita if we can get her, and then we will take the questions and answers. We are recording, you will get the materials, so everybody who has signed up will get the materials, but for the moment, if you please have any questions, send them through the Q&A at the bottom, okay? We will take those after the presentations are done. And keep sharing through the panel, the chat. You know, I can see there are people from London, there are people from Ghana, Rwanda, anyway, Mexico, look at this. So, excellent. Sachiko, go ahead. Make sure you unmute yourself and off you go.
Great, thanks so much, Blynn, and thank you everyone for attending today and for the opportunity to speak. Again, my name is Sachi Graber. I work with Rocky Mountain Institute, and I'll be just covering a couple of topics around the mini-grid opportunity that we see today in sub-Saharan Africa, specifically thinking about what some strategies look like for reducing mini-grid costs and taking the market to scale across Africa, really, and beyond. Okay, so just in case some of you maybe aren't familiar with Rocky Mountain Institute or RMI, we're a US-based nonprofit organization, and we work on the sustainable energy transition towards a clean, prosperous, and secure low-carbon future. We've been working in the US for coming up on 40 years, but our Africa program called Sustainable Energy for Economic Development has been working there for about the last 5 years. We partner specifically with governments, development partners, NGOs, developers, kind of you name it, to bring some on-the-ground expertise in our work, which is focused on identifying affordable, efficient, and resilient solutions that also support economic development at the same time. So our work right now is focused largely in Nigeria, Ethiopia, and Malawi, although we've worked in a handful of other countries as well. And we're working both on sort of holistic national energy strategies, as well as specifically looking at the off-grid rural electrification opportunities in these countries. So just to provide a little bit of context, since maybe there are a few people among us who aren't so familiar with the mini-grid space, we talk about mini-grids as being a community scale energy solution. So what that means is within a specific community, maybe think of a small town, you have an isolated, dedicated source of generation. Often that looks like solar, but it doesn't have to be. You have dedicated distribution networks that connect multiple customers to that generation. And the community scale of mini-grids is really important to their role in the energy space, because obviously this is only one of many ways that you can think about electrifying, the next billion. But mini-grids as a community scale solution are really important for bridging the gap between larger and smaller systems. So larger scale solutions such as grid extension can be efficient at a national scale, but if you think about extending the grid, expanding the grid to very remote areas, they aren't usually cost effective. On the other hand, solar home systems are great for household level electrification, but often they're not actually able to power the productive uses that really drive economic development. So we see mini-grids as kind of playing in this sweet spot and connecting the bigger and the smaller solutions to really serve at the community level. Across Africa, some work that RMI has done indicates that mini-grids can be a tens of billions of dollar opportunity. And this largely comes from the fact that off-grid customers today are really excited about making the transition from expensive, polluting, inefficient alternatives that they use right now. These can be diesel generators, kerosene lanterns, to more centralized, efficient, and clean solutions like mini-grids. At the same time, mini-grids are saving customers money, and they offer, again, tens of billions of dollars of revenue opportunity for developers across the continent. I think for many of us, the obvious next question that comes from that is, why haven't mini-grids gotten to scale? And in a recent report that RMA put out, it's called Mini-Grids and the Money. We try to outline some of the challenges and opportunities to actually scaling the mini-grid sector. And the four major challenges that we've outlined that today are preventing mini-grids from really profiting and scaling across Africa and beyond are these. So first, mini-grid costs are very high, and this comes from both high upfront costs and high operating costs. Obviously, high costs can limit investment as well as customer ability and willingness to pay. Second, capacity utilization is often low. And so by that, we're referring to the amount of energy that's consumed compared to the capacity of the system, the ability of the system to provide energy. Just to give you one example, often in rural Nigeria, for kind of a mid-sized community, you might think about a 100 kilowatt system as being sort of the standard that we see installed. But within the first year or two of mini-grid operations, customers usually only demand 20 kilowatts at peak times. So you have 20 kilowatts of demand versus a 100 kilowatt system. And that means obviously there's a lot of money tied up in that infrastructure that's been installed, which isn't returning any revenue because the system is so much larger than the community needs today. So kind of right-sizing the system continues to be a challenge. The third challenge that we highlight is that financing can be unavailable, and where it is available, it can be very expensive. This kind of stems from the small scale of the mini-grid sector today, the small size of mini-grid projects in general compared to large-scale grid-scale projects, and high forex risk in many of the countries we're talking about. And then finally, the last challenge is around policy that can be unpredictable and unsupportive. So kind of thinking both about the country level as well as a comparison of policy in multiple countries. Policies are often inconsistent and inconsistently enforced around really vital issues like tariff setting, licensing procedures, import duty. And this inconsistency increases the perception of risk around mini-grid systems, which comes back and affects the financing availability, et cetera. So to address these four challenges, we've tried to identify 6 unique categories that we can use to bring down mini-grid costs and really help the sector scale. And across these 6 categories are, again, in this report, which I do recommend you take a look at if you're interested. But we show that the levelized cost of electricity, or the LCOE of electricity from mini-grids, can be cut to about 1/3 of where it is today over only a couple of years. And so that's by addressing these categories of hardware, load management, customer engagement, project development, finance, and policy. And just as a note, while these last 2 categories of finance and policy, they look like small segments in terms of the full cost, but it's really critical to helping mini-grids scale that we have supportive and enabling economic and policy environments that can support developers, support investment, and really help grow the market. So for today, just for the sake of time, I'd like to focus on the 3 highest impact opportunities, which alone account for about 50% of the cost reduction. First, looking at hardware costs, what we see today is that for kind of a standard mini grid of that meets about 100 kilowatts of peak load. So again, think about a mid-sized rural community, maybe 500 connections. This can actually cost $1 million to build. And this is largely driven by the generation and storage assets. So you see the biggest components to this cost stack are the battery cost, the diesel, and the solar. And obviously, looking into the future, we hope that battery costs will fall over time, but even excluding those global cost reduction trends, we see a really key opportunity in the short term to bring down costs through modular and standardized solutions. And what we mean by that is, modular or scalable solutions would be able to grow or to change size over time as load changes. So again, in the example I gave earlier, rather than installing a system of 100 kilowatt capacity, when we don't see that demand today, rather install a system of a much smaller capacity and allow the system to expand as we see increasing customer demand. And by installing systems in this way, which is technically possible given the technology we have today, we can actually bring down the LCOE by something like 20%. For the second opportunity, load management really refers to the customer side, how customer demand kind of matches up with resource potential. So we talk a lot about productive use demand stimulation in this opportunity. And productive use refers to income generating activities, for example, maybe agricultural processing or more industrial processes like welding. And there are 2 really critical benefits to productive uses. First, if you think about, income generating activities, those tend to happen during the day. And conveniently, when you look at solar mini grids, the sun shines during the day, which means by increasing demand during the daytime, we're increasing the capacity utilization of those cheap electrons that are coming from the solar. On the flip side, on the customer side, productive uses can actually really support economic development. So if you envision a farmer who today maybe sells unprocessed grain at market, the ability to grind grain locally and sell a product that has that value add, selling milled grain instead, increases the farmer's revenue. And that not only supports the farmer's well-being and their family's well-being, but it also supports their ability to pay for services like electricity. And so we start to enter this virtuous cycle where the mini grid is supporting economic development, but then customers are also growing in ways that allow them to consume more and support the mini grid. Finally, I'll just touch on this last opportunity of customer engagement. But we often think of customer engagement as a very small component of mini grid operations. And it's true, in terms of cost, it is a small component, but customer engagement accounts for really, really important activities like load assessment surveys, tariff setting, billing processes, the productive use demand stimulation we talked about. And so by engaging in these activities and maybe by investing slightly more in them, we talk about conducting customer engagement early and often throughout the process. Mini grid operators really improve the transparency of their operations and build customer trust, which helps with customer retention, helps with bill payment, and really helps the mini grid to be successful as an investment. So I'm keeping an eye on the time. I'll move on. These, as well as some other opportunities for scaling the mini grid market, they're all available on our website, and they're available freely, so please download them if they're of interest. Or I offer that you're welcome to reach out via our website or to me directly with any questions or follow-ups or thoughts on this. So thanks very much, and back to Belinda.
Thank you very much, Chico. I would ask you, if you may, just to take those links and stick them in the chat box anyway, so that people can download them now if they want. In any case, those are in the presentation, so you guys will get hold of it. But you know, by all means, send them through. And now, if you stop sharing, I have a feeling that customer engagement may only be 3%, but it may be also the key to success. Sounds like, but we'll get to that in the questions. Don't be shy, people. Send your questions. You know, this is the only time where you're gonna have such two experts here answering. And meanwhile, Nicole, please could you prepare your screen and make sure to unmute yourself so that we can hear you. So a reminder for everybody, whether you've been here from before or you've joined, we are recording, we'll send you the materials. Please send your questions through the Q&A box. So Chico is going to share the reports now so you can download them. And we'll take questions thereafter. I don't think, sadly, we're going to be able to get Sunita on the line. However, I do have something super exciting to tell you all, and is that this is the first ever webinar that ATA Insights has conducted with only ladies. This is the first one. This is amazing, so thank you very much, ladies. We have done about 120 plus webinars, and this is the first one with only ladies. We've had a lot with only men, as you guys know, so I'm delighted. Anyway, Nicole, if you can unmute yourself, please, and then, yeah, perfect.
Voila.
Hi, yes, we can hear you perfectly. Go ahead.
Hi, everyone. My name is Nicole Poindexter, as I mentioned before, and I'm the CEO of Energicity Corp. As I said, we are a solar-powered mini-grid company. Our goal is to serve the 1 billion people without electricity with affordable, reliable electricity through solar-powered microgrids or mini-grids, as you wish. And our goal is to provide electricity that serves any or every household and commercial need in rural communities that are not grid connected. Now, let me just double click on a couple of those value points because it will sort of tie into the main presentation. When I say reliable, what we do is we provide 24-hour electricity, AC electricity. So we've got solar panels, batteries, poles and wires, and we've got a prepaid smart meter on every home. So it's reliable 24-hour electricity. It's scalable. So we've got customers who are just using lights and cell phone charging. And then we've got customers who are using irons and water pumps and grain mills. The list goes on. So, but the goal really is to provide electricity that spans the gamut of what people need it for. And the last point is affordability. We have really focused on that as a company. We thought that was the linchpin of the value proposition. I will talk a lot more about affordability, but as a context, our goal was to be significantly lower costs than what people are currently spending today for electricity access, but also cost competitive with the national grids. We are starting with 100,000 people served or to be served over the course of the next 2 years. That's across our footprint in Ghana, where we have 15 mini grids, in Sierra Leone, where we have 32 mini grids under development. And then in Nigeria, we're just starting there, but we already have a few projects underway. So I mentioned before the importance of the value proposition and specifically around affordability. We think that this is a core, it's a core priority in order to get the commercialization of mini grids right. And it's also something that I think mini grid operators as a whole have really struggled with. So the first thing on affordability, the question everyone asks is, can rural people actually afford electricity and electricity provided through a mini grid? And the most important thing for people to know here is that not having electricity is far more expensive for most people than having electricity through solar home systems, through mini grids, through any solar-based technology. You know, and the point in case here, and I've got two cases. One is this customer that we were talking to. She's on the left. She's holding in her hand a very small light. And that very small light, she spends almost $4 a month to keep the batteries, to keep fresh batteries in it. to light her restaurant. And that does not look like it provides a whole lot of light, and she's spending a lot of money for it. By comparison, Black Star Energy, our subsidiary in Ghana, we offer electricity that's 2 lights, some radio, perhaps some TV for $1.80 a month. So almost half the price that she's already paying for a very small light. And then by comparison, there's also solar home systems. Solar home systems are a great solution, though they can tend to be a little bit on the expensive side. In this case, a solar home system offers 3 light bulbs, so a little more electricity than the 2 lights that I was mentioning before, but for $9 a month. So literally 5 times the cost available for solar mini grids. So while there are cost challenges, I think the important thing for people to know is that these cost challenges are worth tackling because mini grids have the possibility of being the lowest cost option for rural customers. The second point is there's a really interesting study that Cross Boundary just released on price elasticity. And this is one of the challenges that mini grid operators face. And it's why it's so hard to get this right. What they found is they were testing this concept of in the developed world, you typically think that if someone has electricity, they're going to pay for it no matter how much it costs, and they're going to use the same amount no matter how much it costs. Generally speaking, that's the idea, that electricity demand is inelastic. But what they found in Cross Boundary in doing a controlled test between 2 different mini grids in East Africa is that if they reduce the price of electricity, that vertical line at about month 6, if they reduce the cost of electricity, they expected the gray line would happen, that the revenues would decline. But what they actually found is that revenues stayed constant or actually even increased, because what happened when people had lower cost electricity is they bought televisions, they bought new appliances so that they could take advantage of it. So this whole idea of where to strike the price and what that impact is on revenue is definitely something that the industry is wrestling with. But in general, it seems lower is better. So the analysis that RMI is doing and Sachi specifically is doing around how to get those prices lower is really critical for our industry. So I talked about a price value ratio. The other side of that question is, what's the value? I mean, obviously people care about having kilowatt hours, but what do people value more? Is it availability? Is it the flexibility to use whatever appliance they want? They can use irons, which is one thing that a lot of our customers really want to do, but those are very high energy intensive appliances. So can they use it for whatever they want? How easy is it to use? How easy is it to pay for? What's the tariff structure? What does it allow? What does it not allow? The interesting question is that these are not fixed answers. These are trade-offs, and mini grid operators need to trade off. Do I want to provide 100% reliability at a much higher cost? Do I want to limit the capacity charges so that people can only use certain amounts of electricity so I can plan my capacity better? Do I reduce the ease of use? Do I make it a little bit harder for people to use so that I can reduce my costs? All of these things are questions that mini grid operators, I think, are wrestling with. And while an individual mini grid operator may have the answer for them, the reality is we don't know what the right answer is for the industry and for the scaling up and widespread commercialization of mini grids. And that actually kind of points to the data that I had below. It's actually from an internal survey we did of our customers. We were trying to get at both a customer satisfaction metric as well as a bunch of other data. And the 2 things that we found, how do people rate our electricity service? We had 87% good to very good, which is great, but could we do better? And I think that could we do better has to do with some of the choices that we've made between availability and price, for instance. On the right, it's a net promoter score concept where we look at how many people recommend our service versus how many people don't recommend your service, then you net the two. It's a common metric for customer satisfaction in the industry. And a net promoter score of 84 is great, actually. But that said, is that the right score for optimizing and scaling mini-grids to get to the largest number of people? Do you reduce certain things about service, reducing that satisfaction metric in order to reach more people profitably? And these are questions. We have an answer at Black Star Energy and at Energicity Corp, but I think that there are many valid answers for these questions. That said, when you enable customer success, there's some things that it really looks like. I mean, one is there's a dramatic increase in economic development. I love to tell the story of this woman, Abena. She's one of our customers, and she, before we brought electricity, sold ice and fish but she really had very low income, because by the time she got the ice and fish to her community, her ice was melting and her fish was spoiling, so she just had very low sales. But once we brought the electricity, she saw the electricity was affordable enough that she could keep her profits and reliable enough for her to buy the freezer that she wanted. So she bought the freezer, and her income has actually increased by 11 times. So a dramatic increase in economic development is possible when you get those trade-offs between reliability and pricing right. The other thing that we've seen in terms of getting reliability and pricing right is we've actually seen dramatic increases in customer loads. The yellow line is actually the increase in annual growth that we've seen across all of our customers. So total load sold. But I think one of the more important data for this conversation is we've also seen on an individual basis 27% annual load growth. So that is really speaking to, we're delivering a service that allows our customers to succeed. What I'm saying here is that having the key to commercialization is having a strong value proposition, including a low cost. But one of the things that we wrestle with is, if we've got a low cost, how do we make the unit economics work? So one of the strategies that mini grid operators are pursuing, and this is something that Sachi mentioned, is how do we get more productive loads? But the reality is there are a lot of challenges to making that strategy successful. It is an important strategy for us to figure out, but it is a challenge. And those challenges range from technical demand of loads, or the technical demand on the loads. So if you take the example that Sachi was saying, like, is this a load that is primarily during the day when you've got excess generation? Or is it primarily at night, in which case it's actually going to increase your costs? So thinking about those things, thinking about how you think about capacity, are the economics right for three-phase? All of those questions relating to the technical demand of having these productive loads become really critical issues for deploying productive uses. Beyond that, what's the right business model? Are you finding entrepreneurs in each village? Or are you as a mini grid operator running the business yourself? There's a wide range of strategies here. And in fact, the report that I mentioned at the bottom, and I can send out the link on the chat, but that report at the bottom goes through a number of the different strategies that different mini grid operators have, but there's not a fixed answer here. Value chain disruption. If you're changing the way people produce their produce. So for instance, if they're milling grain, they now have a new buyer than the one they had before when they were selling corn. How do you educate people about that? How do you make sure that value chain disruption doesn't end up in a glut that actually depresses the economy? And then another challenge is equipment financing and ensuring that they're the right people have credit. So there are a number of different challenges to making productive uses work. But then beyond that, another strategy is actually to drive operational efficiency. And our approach to operational efficiency has come down to technology. So how can we use technology to reduce our costs? Process. Where can we drive process so that we can increase efficiency? So for instance, when we started building mini grids, it took us 8 weeks, if not more, to construct a mini grid. Now, by virtue of the processes we put in place, it takes us 3 weeks to construct a mini grid. So focusing in on a process becomes really critical. And then building a great team, which quite frankly we've been very fortunate in being able to do that. And it's something that a lot of mini grid operators don't talk a lot about, but in the long run, having the right team, having the right trained maintenance resources, the right trained construction resources, et cetera, actually becomes critical to driving that operational efficiency and meeting metrics that allow mini grids to be profitable and sustainable. And then lastly, I'll touch on something that Sachi also mentioned. It's regulation. Regulation can be a barrier to scaling mini grids, and many countries, regulation has been a barrier. It can also be encouraging. In Sierra Leone, the regulatory structure is very promising. In Nigeria, the regulatory structure is very promising. In Sierra Leone in particular, there'll be 100 mini grids rolled out over the course of the next year and a half, serving probably around 400,000 people, so a huge program enabled by the regulation. But all that said, no matter what, regulation is always considered a risk. And this is primarily by financiers, but also I think mini grid operators. And there's two key components to that. One is pricing and pricing strategies and what regulators allow mini grid operators to price. Some of the key things that we've been thinking about are kind of these probabilistic risks. How do you price in the risk of a devaluation? How do you price in the risk of the grid connecting? But those types of risks and whether or not regulators let you include those in the tariff and the tariff cost structure become a real issue for long-term viability. This core question of whether or not the grid comes, also a key question for mini grid operators, and whether or not the regulators continue to support private sector interventions, which we're seeing in some countries where they've changed their mind on that. Even if the regulation starts out encouraging, in the back of everyone's mind are these concerns that some of these challenges may crop up in the future. So that becomes a barrier. Even if the regulations are good now, it becomes a barrier to future expansion and future commercialization because of that perceived risk. So I'm happy to answer a lot of questions. There were a number of subjects that I could have covered but didn't. But let me end here with thank you for your time, and my contact information is there if you come up with questions after this session.
Thank you ever so much, Nicole, for your presentation. I'm going to ask you to stop sharing, and we did have a few questions, so we are going to stop sharing. No, not unmute, because we're going to need to hear you, just the screen. So okay, that we can see you, like, then both you and Sachiko become larger and we can see you easier. Much better. So, okay, we have a few questions here. We're going to start with this. I have to say, I cannot help every time I hear you guys talk about these things that are real and that make people's lives so much better. I feel excited. I feel this is why I got into this business for, right? Where you can change people's lives for real. So, you know, Nicole's presentation and seeing the pictures, it makes me really excited about changing, or like, you guys, it's possible, it's here. This is what we're here for, you know, to make people's lives better. But anyway, let's start with the questions. Right, Raymond here sends a question. He says, in Sachiko's presentation, did I miss a clear explanation of how much of the initial CapEx comes from installation of storage batteries, and how much potential of reducing the LCOE can be created by forecast declines in the cost of storage? So did you guys talk about storage much in those reports?
We do touch on them in the reports. Let me just quickly
share
back to this slide that I shared originally. So I think to answer your question specifically, Raymond, the installation costs for all components are included in this 4% of the CapEx, and that's given, you know, an assessment of projects that are on the ground and operational today. So obviously these are all subject to change going forward. And I think your point about future battery costs is very well taken. We do get to that in the Minigrids and the Money report, but I actually, for the purposes of most of our analysis, we've been trying to focus pretty carefully on short-term opportunities because we see this as something that needs to be solved now, not in 10 years when we see battery costs coming down to 20% of what they are today. So I think your point is well taken, that there is a huge opportunity there as we see technologies improving, but at the same time, I would posit that there are ways to use the technology we have now to create affordable solutions.
That's a good point, well made in there. We know we don't really have time to wait for those prices to come down. Plus, I mean, 10 years, it remains in the air. I mean, Raymond, this is one of the things I suppose we need to consider. How long is it going to take? You know, Tesla and a few of the other manufacturers have come out and said, hang on, guys, there isn't materials for everyone, which I'm sure is not true. You know, there's going to be materials for everything. We're going to find a way. It's just not going to be immediate. So it's an interesting question there. All right. Another question about Minihydro, and it says, could Minihydro ever be a substitute for diesel, for example, in mountainous areas, or is diesel always necessary? So I'm sure in this study you also looked at Minihydro.
If that's to me, we have mostly focused our studies on PV technologies simply because they tend to be more ubiquitous. Minihydro is a great resource where there's a resource. I think the question there is, usually we think about pulling in diesel when you have kind of peaking demand. And so, you know, compared to your base capacity to provide electricity through PV or hydro or whatever your technology is, we usually turn on the diesel when there's some kind of shortage in that supply or some kind of peak in the demand. And so with many Minihydro facilities, you still see a diesel component in case you have, you know, some additional load come on unexpectedly that requires a fast response.
Which productive use revenue streams do you see most successfully applied in sub-Saharan Africa within mini-grids? It says example, water pumping, ice sale, electrical appliances sale, cold storage, thermal energy. You know, you guys can take, I'm sure that you both have opinions. So who wants to go first? Nicole? Maybe?
Sure. Sure. We actually find that freezers are the most popular productive use. And it's for two reasons. One, they're easy to deploy, they're single phase, and people know how to use them. And what I mean by that is it's not meaningfully disruptive to the supply chain. Like they were trading before, as in the case of my example of my customer, she was selling ice and fish before. Adding a freezer is just making that process more efficient. When you get to other loads like grain milling or cold storage for agricultural uses, like as opposed to trading uses, you start to see both bigger loads, which you start to see challenges with business model, like who's the entrepreneur who's running it. And you also start to see issues around, you know, things like market timing. So there's a solar customer who does have cold storage, but they haven't quite figured out how to time the market and when they should bring their goods to market now that they have flexibility. So they're bringing it at the same time, which actually reduces the value of their produce. So we find that freezers are the most successful, and I think there's a broader kind of figuring out the business model for other types of uses. I will say for us, we think mills are promising. It's just a little bit tougher to figure out, but mills are promising. There's some issues around peaking because, again, milling tends to happen at one time of year. So your demand goes from, let's say you've got a typical baseload demand of 20 kilowatt hours, and then during the milling period, that quadruples. The question is, do you build electricity, do you build capacity for that quadrupled load just during the 8 weeks a year when there's milling? So there's some challenges around milling, but we're excited about that. We're excited about ice making, particularly for fishing communities. And we're excited about sort of more value add to, you know, to food processing. So tomatoes to tomato paste, as an example.
Sachiko, would you like to add? Are you quite happy with that answer?
I think Nicole covered almost all of it. The only other angle I would maybe add is I think it really depends where you're working regionally. For example, a lot of the stories we hear coming out of East Africa, where you have very small communities operating under more traditional structures, the need there tends to be for smaller appliances. It tends to be more, can we get a refrigerator to the site even? There are some additional logistical challenges. And for example, in Nigeria, a lot of the systems we see are cropping up in kind of peri-urban areas. So there's a lot more demand upfront for the larger operations like milling. But I think Nicole really covered all of it in her answer.
Great, freezers. That is the main thing. It's interesting, actually. Okay, so one question here that I think is really good. It's just really simple. It's like, what are your thoughts on getting the cost of electricity down to that of charcoal so women can cook with electricity? I hope this G. Anderson, you're referring to whomever cooks. It could be a man as well, since we're in the right. But mainly, I'm sure in this area is women. But yeah. So, what are your thoughts on this?
I'll start, but Sachi, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this too. So the main barrier to, I think, switching I actually think this is a really complicated issue, not a simple one. The barriers to switching to clean cooking, I think, are not really cost, or not as much cost as they are technology, and that a lot of people just like cooking on charcoal. And that's unfortunate, but it is what it is. That said, honestly, that would be a significant reduction in cost, and I'm not sure that electricity gets that low. What we are seeing is customers are using our electricity for kind of ancillary cooking. So for instance, they've got hot water kettles. So in the morning, instead of starting a fire to boil water for porridge or for hot drinks, they've got a tea kettle instead. So they're reducing their charcoal usage while not completely replacing it. Similarly, we have some of our customers who have microwaves. And those tend to be customers who lived in the city, maybe they're nurses or teachers who have come to the community. But so we are seeing that there is some transition, but I expect it will be slow, and I expect it will be more based on ease than cost parity. But Sachi, love to hear your thoughts.
Sachi?
I think I automatically have to defer to Nicole for the behavioral side, although I think that does mirror many of the challenges we've heard with the kind of clean cook stove attempted transition. I guess I'm more familiar with the financial side, so from that perspective, yeah, I mean, if you're looking at mini-grids, which have an average, LCOE of something like 60 cents today, that doesn't come close to the cost of charcoal. I think that as we do transition to lower cost systems, and as governments maybe in the future become able to provide some sort of subsidy structure for mini-grid customers so that they're not paying more than their urban counterparts, I think on the cost side we'll start to come close. I think it does go back to what Nicole was saying though, with, you have to have customers who are willing to make that transition for it even to be a question. And if we're not seeing that now, it feels like there's not a huge driver at this point on the cooking side.
Thank you very much. I suppose it's a question so much as money as also time. When you have working women, working chefs, if you like, then, you need something that is quicker as well. But I mean, just thinking from a social perspective, I suppose. All right, a few more questions to get through. We're going to try to finish in like 5 minutes or so. So I am mindful. I want to answer as many questions as possible. Question to Sachiko says here. You underline the high mini-grid cost reduction potential in hardware through making the system smaller, sizing it right. When designing the system, how do you determine, optimize the number of components needed, and how do you make sure that all demands are met in each hour?
It's actually a great question, and it's one that maybe we'll turn it over to Nicole after this, but I think it's one that hasn't been answered very well in the industry so far. there continue to be challenges with load estimation before you build the system. I think what we've seen so far and what we can learn from is that we tend to overestimate load today, and customers tend to over predict the amount they'll require. So if you talk to a customer before building a mini grid, they'll tell you, you know, I need to use X appliance for 5 hours a day. And then once you build the system, you see it's only being used for 2 hours a day. So I think part of the answer is that we need to adjust our survey methodologies and our load estimation methodologies to account for that. But I also think that, I mean, part of the beauty of a modular system is that it can change. So acknowledging that, maybe we size the system smaller than we think we need, and we scale them up, you know, a month into the process if it looks like our load is greater than we expected. I think that offers sort of a safe way to adjust the system to customer needs without taking on that huge upfront expense. But Nicole, what are your thoughts there?
Well, I completely agree. And we are in practice doing exactly what you said, sizing systems smaller and then scaling them up. We don't aim to scale up within a month, but rather we target kind of a year, and then if the demand isn't there, we can also contract the system. So, and it's precisely for the reason that Sachi said. I remember when I started out, I very eagerly did a demand survey and found that it was so wrong, it wasn't even funny. And that mirrors actually behavior all over the world. Like, we don't intrinsically understand electricity and how much we're using and what we're using it for. And then you add to that complexity in the case of rural customers who've never had electricity. They don't know what appliances they're going to buy and what quality. They also don't know how the new electricity impacts their income. And that can be positively, they start a business and their income dramatically increases. It can also be, in terms of thinking about their available income, it also could be lower because now they're buying ice cream and they're buying new things because it's now available. So I actually think in terms of thinking about load, the analysis that Cross Boundary did, thinking about elasticity, and that actually budgets tend to be fixed and what people fill them with is what's variable. And how much electricity is what's variable depending on our price. I think that ends up being really, don't know why I disappeared. Can you hear me? Oh, I'm back.
You did disappear, but because I was hearing you, I was like, it's fine. Here we go.
So the analysis that Cross Boundary did on income elasticity, I actually think is really pointing in the right direction in terms of being able to predict loads.
Excellent, thank you very much. Okay, we have several very interesting questions, and I know, I'm mindful, we don't have any time actually. I said I would finish now, but I just want to get some quick answers on this, if I may. One is like the item of like hot water, you know, sanitary water, you know, it seems wasteful, you know, to use electricity to heat it up. Is there any plans or designs by which, you know, you also use hot water through solar? So maybe start with this one and then I'll ask you a couple more.
I think quickly what we've seen is that there is an opportunity there. It's not being explored so much right now. I know there's at least one company based out of Minnesota in the US who is investigating that. And if you're interested, maybe shoot me an email and I'm happy to get you in touch.
All right, there are several companies that do this, like the hot water. I just don't know whether, you know, it's combining. Nicole, did you want to add anything or are you happy with that? No? Okay. All right, then there is another one here that asks about Nigeria. I don't know how much you guys know about Nigeria. It says, you know, what do you think of the sector now under 2017 regulations? What equity sizes are feasible? What returns are expected? That sort of thing. So if you want to comment briefly on that.
I'll jump in, though Sachi is a total expert on Nigeria, but we think the regulations are great. We think the opportunity is huge, as Sachi said, you know, billions of dollars. And actually there's an RMI report on Nigeria that estimates the market size to be about $8 billion.
Thanks, Nicole.
Yeah, I'm quoting.
Nope, that's right.
Yeah. But there's a huge opportunity, and then when you particularly add in the results-based financing window from the World Bank that unfortunately Sunita hasn't been able to join to talk about, but when you add in the subsidy interventions, we think that it'll be a very high returning market. That said, what everyone says about Nigeria is it's a complicated market to operate in, and won't go into all of those things. I suspect, though, that the returns will be harder to reap than we expect, but we're super excited about the market.
Do you want to add
maybe
anything?
just a couple very small points to add on, but I think that totally captured it. We agree the regulations in Nigeria are really far and away among the strongest in Africa. For investors, there are some nice safeties built into the regulation in terms of, in the case of grid extension, how is the mini-grid protected, which is something that's kind of unique and helpful from that perspective. There are a lot of subsidy opportunities coming up in Nigeria through the World Bank, the REA, et cetera. Although I think actually one of our concerns is that there's going to be so many projects flooding the market that it actually might be a little bit overwhelming for a while. And I think the other point on investment in Nigeria is that Nigeria has a lot of money compared to many sub-Saharan African countries, and so in terms of customer ability and willingness to pay, we see Nigeria as a really actually critical starting point to scaling mini grids, because we have kind of willing customers who are interested in engaging today.
So it's an immediate market, so it's a good place to be then. Okay, what about, I'm gonna make this particular webinar was about Africa and Africa only. However, someone asks here, what about Asia? Potentially it's larger, the market over there. So do you have any comments on that?
I'm not an expert, but the data, and again, Sachi, you can correct me, but the data, I believe, is that the Indian market specifically, or the Asian market, is a bit smaller than the African market, but actually concentrated in a fewer number of countries. So it actually potentially is easier to access. There are a number of very active mini grid operators in India in particular that are doing a great job. So it's definitely an important market, and it's one that in many ways I'm sure is different from Africa, but there's some people who are very active in the space.
Yeah, and I think in terms of those developers being active, India really seems to be where mini grids started to take off and to become kind of commercial. So I think there's a number of studies highlighting that. Rockefeller through Smart Power India has done some. I know there are many organizations who have studied those mini grid projects in particular and thought about kind of the influences that they'll have on scaling mini grids worldwide.
Okay, excellent. So I think the time has come, for us to say goodbye, but would you like to add anything now before we leave? Any last thoughts from you girls?
I will say thank you. Thank you for your time. That's really fantastic. And, I hope we've left you with that there's both a huge opportunity. And while there's some challenges, there is nothing great that will be done without a few challenges. And I think that we're really actually quite close to cracking the solution. It's really just a matter of, or at least a workable solution that will continue to get better. It's just a matter of continuing to innovate and to market this opportunity so that people get comfortable with the risks, because the risks in everything. So why not take the risks on something that is so important to do?
That's beautiful. Sachiko?
I don't think I can improve on that. Thank you all for attending, and thank you, Bowen, for the opportunity. It's so exciting to see the interest in this sector and the incredible work that's being done by people like Nicole and companies who are actually really taking the risk to go and see whether this can be a way to build up electrification efforts.
So thank you very much, Nicole. Thank you very much, Sachi. It's a shame that Sunita Indian couldn't join, but thank you very much for the first all ladies panel, sorry. And thank you very much for all of our audience. This has been great. And actually you've had a lot of people here with very interesting also remits, reaching out saying, hey, maybe I can help. So you know, you've got this lady's email, so let's get this industry moving forward, well connected. Thank you very much for everything, and speak soon. See you next time.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.